Hi, welcome to Elf Needleworks. I'm Elf, and today I'll be showing you some general advice for working through your scrap stash, as well as giving you a specific pattern designed to work through a large amount of scraps. If you're just here for the pattern, this is the timestamp where the pattern starts. I'll also have more detailed timestamps in the description. The first step to using up your scraps is getting them all in one place and assessing what you have. Take a look at your scraps and sort similar yarns into similar categories. What you're looking for here is similar fiber content and similar yarn weight. You're also looking in general at how many scraps you have. From here, you'll be able to determine what types of projects you can make using your scraps. Take a look at the pile of yarn and compare it to things that you have made in the past. If the pile of yarn physically looks to be about the same size as a folded up sweater, it likely means that you have approximately enough yarn to make a sweater. You also want to take a look at your fiber content and determine the most practical use of that fiber. For example, if you have a lot of wool yarn, you might be better off making sweaters, hats, scarves. If you have a lot of acrylic yarn, that's really good for things that get washed frequently, like blankets or rugs. If you have a lot of silk, that might be great for a summer shirt. Yarn weight is also going to play a bit of a factor in what you can make. If you have a lot of sport weight yarn, for example, you're likely going to be looking at something like socks or maybe a shawl. If you have bulky weight yarn, you could make a really fantastic blanket, and I am jealous of you. Now that you have a general idea of the kind of project that you want, you have to pick out a project. I personally find a lot of my patterns on Etsy or Ravelry. The filtering system on Ravelry is fantastic for scrap projects. Anytime I do a scrap project, I go to the filter bar on the side, pick my yarn weight, the kind of project I'm looking to make, and sometimes I'll put in an approximation of yardage. This gives me a plethora of patterns to pick from. But how do I decide which pattern from here? In my opinion, any pattern can be made using scraps. However, when I am making a scrap project, I like to look for very specific traits in the patterns that I choose. The first thing that I look for is something simple. Now, simple here doesn't necessarily mean easy. In general, this means you don't want to look at a pattern that relies heavily on color work. In crochet, I tend to avoid patterns that have front post or back post crochets. In knitting, I tend to avoid patterns that have cables or a lot of lace work. I find that anything that's particularly complex tends to pull away from the design that you can get using just rows of different colors. While you're looking at patterns, you want to think about how you want to use your scraps. There are two sort of main categories of scrap busting that I like to employ. One involves starting with one scrap in a certain color and working until that scrap is completely used up and then starting on the next scrap. This works pretty well for most projects and will give a wider striping effect. Unless your scraps are really small, then it'll give a smaller stripe effect. I also like to use this method while working with multiple strands of yarn at once. Using multiple strands at once is going to get you thicker, sturdier fabric, so I tend to use this for things like rugs or maybe baskets. I also find that using a one-note pattern works best for the multiple strand method. What I mean by a one-note pattern is a pattern that is primarily utilizing one stitch. Here are two examples of rugs that I made using the 3-strand method. One of these is made using the wattle stitch, and the other is made using single crochets and then a spike stitch every now and again. When using the 3-strand method, you start by picking up 3 different scraps, holding them all together and working as if they are all one yarn. When one of the strands runs out, all you need to do is replace it with a different random scrap. When I use this method, I like to make sure each ball of yarn or scrap that I'm working from is a different length, meaning that they'll all end at different times and it'll give more of a blend or gradient effect to the project. You can use 2 strands, 4 strands, 5 strands, 6 strands with this method. I personally find 3 is about the sweet spot that prevents frustration and tangles while I'm working. If you do want to try this method, I I actually have a free pattern for some baskets that uses 6 strands at once. The other category of scrap busting does not involve using up the entirety of a scrap in one go. Instead, this method requires you to change colors pretty much every row. This is probably my favorite method for use with everything that isn't a rug or basket. Most patterns will work relatively well with this, but I do find large blankets that are done in the round tend not to work so well. The reason for this is that when you're working on the center of the blanket, you're using much smaller lengths of yarn than once you get to the edge. The edge of a very large blanket worked in the round uses a considerable amount of yarn, and at that point, generally my scraps are nowhere near big enough to make it all the way around even once. Another thing that I really like to do with scrap projects is to incorporate a yarn that isn't scrap. I find that this method bulks up my yardage and also can make a piece look more cohesive and purposeful. I generally gather my scraps together and then get a couple of skeins in a neutral color. Generally I'm using black, white, or even an off-white color. In this sweater, I was aware that I didn't have quite the yardage I needed to complete a full sweater, so I was able to use this cream color to make it look a bit more cohesive, as well as to bulk out my yardage. In this blanket that I'm currently working on, I used the black to make the huge variety of yarns that I'm using look a bit more cohesive. I also would strongly recommend a granny square project because you can kind of work on it as your scraps grow. It's a really great long-term project to keep on the back burner and gives you something that you can return to whenever you want to work on something but aren't really sure what to work on. The reason for this is that I find granny square blankets are super easy to pick up and set down. You also don't necessarily have to use the same granny square pattern all the way through a scrap blanket. You can pick and choose different granny squares based on what you want to work on at the moment. If you have a considerable amount of scraps and you're looking for the perfect blanket pattern, another thing I would like to suggest is going to r/temperature blankets and seeing what patterns people have used there. I find that there is a lot of overlap between scrap blankets and temperature blankets in regards to what works really well for both of those. If you have a pattern that you really like for scrap blankets, be sure to mention it in the comments so that I can reference that when I want to work on my next project. I will go ahead and link any of the patterns that I have shown in the description below. Now, onto the pattern. I designed this pattern so that it could be made using double knit, worsted weight, or Aran weight yarn with a size G or 4mm crochet hook. This blanket is made up of 3 different sections or stripes: the Stalactite Stripe, the Brick Stripe, and the Rope Stripe. It is up to you to decide which order you would like to work these stripes in, or if you'd like to eliminate one of the stripes that you don't like. This pattern is done in US turns. You'll be changing color for each row. You're welcome to crochet over your ends as you go in the project, but if you would like, I will show you 2 ways that I like to deal with all of my ends at the end. If you want to replicate my blanket, I did my stripes in the order stalactite, bricks, stalactite, rope. Before getting into the meat of the pattern, I would like to go over 3 of the stitches that you may not be familiar with: standing single crochet, standing double crochet, and spike stitch. Standing single crochet and standing double crochet are used at the beginning of each row in this blanket. Standing single crochet is made by making a slip knot, putting it over your crochet hook, inserting the hook into the first stitch as if about to perform a single crochet, yarning over, pulling through. You should now have 2 loops on your crochet hook, the slip knot, and 1 yarn over. Yarn over 1 more time and pull that through both loops on your hook. You have now completed your standing single crochet. The standing double crochet is very similar. Make a slip knot, put it over your hook, and then yarn over the hook. This can be a little bit tricky to do as the yarn is going to pull against you and probably try and rotate that slip knot. So make sure that you have a firm grip on those loops that are on your hook. Then insert your hook into the first stitch of the previous row, yarn over and pull through. You should now have 3 loops on your hook. Yarn over one more time, pull it through the first 2 stitches. You should now have 2 stitches on your hook. Yarn over one more time and pull that through both stitches. You've now completed your standing double crochet. The spike stitch is essentially a modified single crochet. To perform the spike stitch, you will start out by having 1 loop already on your crochet hook. Take your crochet hook and instead of inserting it into the V on top of the previous row stitch, insert it underneath the row. Yarn over, pull through. You should now have 2 loops on the hook. Yarn over one more time and pull that through both of the loops on your hook, leaving you with 1 loop. This is a standard spike stitch. The spike stitch can be performed around more than just 1 row of crochet by simply inserting the hook underneath the row that is 2 rows away from the row you are currently working on instead of 1 row, as seen here. Now it's time for your foundation chain. Chain a multiple of 10 stitches plus 2. The length of your blanket will be determined by this chain stitch, so be sure to measure it. For the chain stitch, I usually like to use a crochet hook 1 size up from the one I will be using for the rest of the blanket, because I tend to make my chain stitches rather tight, so sizing up will ensure that the edge of my blanket is just as stretchy as the rest of it. If you want to use one of my methods for finishing the ends, make sure that you are leaving long tails at both ends of the blanket. I would say somewhere around 6 inches. Alright, it is now time to get into the meat of the pattern, starting with the Stalactite Stripe. If you are starting from the foundation chain, yarn over and perform your first double crochet in the chain that is second from the hook. If you are starting a new row, perform a standing double crochet in the first stitch, and then double crochet all the way across and tie off at the end. Turn your work. Using a new color, perform a standing single crochet all the way across, and tie off the yarn. Turn your work. Repeat this row 2 more times for a total of 1 double crochet row and 3 single crochet rows, making sure that you are turning your work each time. For row 5, start with a new yarn, single crochet, spike stitch down 1 row, spike stitch down 2 rows, spike stitch down 3 rows, single crochet. And repeat this across the full length of the blanket. When you are performing this row, ensure that your stitch count is correct every time you complete a repeat. Each repeat should be 5 stitches, and again, those stitches are single crochet, spike stitch down 1 row, spike stitch down 2 rows, spike stitch down 3 rows, single crochet. Once you reach the end, tie off and turn. Create a standing double crochet in the first stitch and then double crochet across, tie off the end, and turn your work. You've just completed your Stalactite Stripe. Next up is the brick stripe. For the first row, create a standing double crochet in the first stitch, double crochet across, tie off and turn. For row 2, perform a standing single crochet across, tie off and turn. For row 3, perform a standing single crochet in the next 4 stitches for a total of 5 single crochets, and then spike stitch down 1 row 5 times. This will get you a total of 5 single crochets followed by 5 spike stitches. Repeat this across the whole row. You'll end with a spike stitch. tie off and turn your work. Repeat this row for a total of 5 times. For row 8, perform a standing double crochet in the first stitch, double crochet across, tie off, and turn. Once you're done, you should have a total of 8 rows, the first row being double crochet, the second being single crochet, rows 3 through 7 being spike stitch rows, and the 8th row being double crochet. You have just finished the brick stripe. It is now time for the rope stripe. For row 1, perform a standing double crochet in the first stitch, double crochet across, tie off, and turn. For row 2, perform a standing single crochet across, tie off, and turn. For row 3, form a standing single crochet and then spike stitch down 1 row. Repeat this across. This row should be an alternating sequence of single crochet and spike stitches all the way across, ending with a spike stitch. Tie off and turn your work. For rows 4 through 9, repeat row 2 and 3 a total of 4 times. You will be ending with a spike stitch row. For the final row, row 10, perform a double crochet across, tie off, and turn your work. This stripe is a total of 10 rows. You have now completed your rope stripe. Continue working and alternating between different stripes based on your order preference until you have completed a blanket in the size that you want. Now I'm going to show you 2 different ways that I like to finish off all of those ends. The first way is by single crocheting with the ends down the side. This method is a little bit tricky. You do not use any additional yarn for this method, and instead will be using all of the ends that you left while working on the main body of the blanket. Start by inserting your hook in the corner of your blanket, yarn over, pull through, and make 1 chain stitch. From here, you are essentially going to be single crocheting all along the edge of the blanket. Every time you reach a new color, when you insert your hook into the fabric, yarn over using the next end in your blanket. Ensure that you are enclosing all of your ends in your single crochet as you work. If you notice that it is starting to get bulky, trim your ends and continue working. As long as the very ends of each yarn are enclosed with single crochet, that should be enough to prevent them from unraveling. This is a rather tricky method and can sometimes lead to wobbly edges or a lot of bulk on the edge. Once you have reached the end of the blanket, tie off using the last scrap. You will have quite a few ends sticking out the end of the blanket at this point. Use a crochet hook to weave those ends underneath the single crochet edging that you just made. Now go back and trim all of the ends that are sticking out along the edge. I like to give each end a light tug just to make sure that they are as flat as possible underneath the single crochet before cutting. Now that we have the difficult solution out of the way, let's move on to my favorite and the easiest solution, making tassels. I will be showing the tassel method on a different scrap blanket. This one is done using double knit and moss stitch with a H hook. To create tassels, simply take a few strands. I like to aim for about 4, tie a knot close to the edge of the blanket, and then cut all of your strands to the same length. I find that the easiest way to ensure that I am trimming all of the ends to the same length is by laying out the blanket on the ground, ensuring that the crochet edge is lined up and straight, and then simply cutting across all of the tassels at once with a pair of sharp scissors. Once you've dealt with all of your ends, that's it. Your blanket is complete. If you do make this blanket, please post pictures. My username is elvneedleworks across most platforms, so please be sure to tag me too so I can see your work. If you would prefer a written pattern, I will be making one and it will be available on my Ravelry. I hope this video did a little bit to help you with your scraps. Did this video help you decide what to do with your scraps? Do you have patterns that you recommend for scrap projects? Would you be interested in seeing a video where I just list out a bunch of my favorite patterns for scraps? Let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing. If you want to see more of my work, I am on various social media sites. Thank you so much for watching. Bye! You made it to the end, so I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. I didn't actually finish both ends of this blanket before starting the video.